Good afternoon, Trinidad and Tobago. My name is Dr. Mark West. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at Eric Williams Medical Sciences Complex. And today I shall be moderating the presentation by Dr. Nicole Ramlachan from her UTT COVID webinar series, Hype or Hope. This is the 9th of 10 presentations, and today's presentation will be entitled, What are the options for the long-term living with COVID-19? We in Trinidad are extremely fortunate to have among our scientists a renowned world expert, Dr. Ramlachan. She holds a PhD in genetics from Texas and A&M University, and a BSc and an MSc from the University of Guelph in Canada. She has extensive experience in research in the areas of genetics, specifically in the area of immunogenetics, clinical genetics, and genomics, bacterial and viral biotechnology, forensic, DNA analysis, and molecular biology. Dr. Ramlachan has worked with the ministerial-approved DNA Committee for the implementation of the Administration Act of DNA in 2012 in Trinidad and Tobago. She is involved in genetic testing locally, including SARS-CoV-2 testing and research, and is certified in the ISO EC 17025 testing laboratory standards. Dr. Ramlachan has also had tissue culture experience and has worked in virology and microbiology projects with research models studying bacterial and HIV retroviral infection, as well as in the production of monoclonal antibodies. In addition, she has set up laboratories in Trinidad, Guyana, Latin America. She holds memberships in several international organizations and has given invited lectures internationally. Dr. Ramlachan is an associate professor in the University of Trinidad and Tobago, and we are extremely fortunate to have her expertise and for her to share with us some very important information regarding COVID-19 and its vaccines. Dr. Ramlachan, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, as usual. Done such a good job of introducing me, and I welcome everyone here with us this evening. I'm going to share my screen at this time. Hope everybody could see me. Start. So again, this is our number 9 in our series, Hyper Hope series, investigating the COVID-19 vaccination. And what we wanted to do with this episode is discuss, just did the wrong thing. Is to discuss what are options for long-term living with COVID-19, right? So what that means is what happens if COVID does not go away next year, the year after? What happens to us? How do we actually cope with continuous COVID-19 infections in the community? Would vaccinations be able to protect us? Is it enough? Really, what are we heading to? So I always start with this chain of infection story in terms of the infectious microbe, how it gets into the body through the reservoir, and the portal of exit, it leads through the mouth and nose, the mucous membranes, the modes of transmission being person to person, airborne, direct contact with the virus in a contaminated surface, the portal of entry again being mouth and nose, mucous areas. I mean, eyes to a less extent, but mostly mouth and nose because the eyes tend to be localized to that area. It doesn't really enter into the body. And then, of course, most importantly, the susceptible host. Without the susceptible host, we don't have this continuous chain of infection. Once that susceptible host population is large enough, this is going to continue, ad infinitum, right? So we have to break the cycle of infection some way. And remember that mutation story that I told you about, how it jumps from the original bat host into the human host is via that spike protein, that little black protein that sticks out on the surface of the virus that has now mutated and continues to mutate over time. And originally in the original zoonotic jump, it was adapted to a bat receptor, and now it became adapted to the ACE2 receptor on the surface of adult alveolar cells. What has happened since, of course, with new variants, it has become more able to adapt and therefore be more highly transmissible, because it's more that lock and key mechanism where that ACE2 receptor is more firm, more stronger, and the virus is able to infect many more lung alveolar cells in a shorter period of time and be able to utilize them as their virus assembly plans come out, infect other lung alveolar cells, infect other immune cells, and so on and so on. And also they've actually adapted to become better at actually doing that lock and key mechanism with the ACE2 receptors of youth and children, which is why some of the variants that we're seeing now are more predominant in that demographic, right? So as these mutations collect more and more, we're going to see more and more the ability of this virus to be able to be more highly transmissible and cause more severe disease, and of course, perhaps even evade immunity, which is a big issue. These are the genes generally of the SARS-CoV-2 genome. Here's the OFF, which is just a coding protein. This is another coding protein, and here's the spike protein. And this is where the instructions are, and that is what the mRNA, DNA based virus vaccines are based on. It's this little sequence here, which is the spike protein, and that is what attaches, again, as I mentioned, to the human cell gene infection. And we sequence this, and that's how we're able to know what genome is actually present in that particular individual, what particular SARS-CoV-2 variant, so to speak, because the changes can be detected via our sequencing techniques and those kinds of things, right? Just to give you a little picture of what's happening in Trinidad, as of the 30th, we have 3,187 cases. The cases were going down quite dramatically, and then we kind of petering up and down a little bit there. Total, we have about 32,793 cases, recovered 24,821, and deaths about 847. The US, just as a matter of reference, has upwards of 604,000 deaths as of today's date, and about 33.6 million cases. So in terms of the increasing number of cases, this is just to compare over time, and we are roughly at about 9th now. This is a few weeks ago, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we're about 7th. And as of today's date, we're the 9th in terms of the most rapid rate of increase of deaths in the world, right? So we are getting better, but we are not as good as we can, as we would like to be at this point in time in terms of seeing those deaths decreasing. It's not decreasing as fast as we would like it to be. If we look at the number of confirmed cases over time, so this is June 21st, this is June 30th, we could see the comparison between the different countries. Trinidad and Tobago is right about 161.90 today. Argentina is at about 456. The UK is on the way up because of the Delta variant taking hold there right now. France, Germany, Canada, Jamaica, Barbados, still more or less flatline. The United States as well, not seeing any general increase, but we saw a big spike in St. Kitts and St. Nevis. They had an outbreak a couple of weeks ago. It's kind of come down now. Guyana is bouncing around right around 150. And Brazil, as you could see, is coming down from their peak that they saw a few weeks ago, as is Argentina. And then it kind of went up again and coming down again. So it really just depends on what's happening with the variants at that particular time in that particular country. Deaths wise, in terms of 7-day rolling average, and I always say we have to compare the 7-day rolling average because we report in such a sporadic way. We have to kind of keep it kind of consistent to be able to compare apples to apples, right? So Colombia is pretty high right now, but are right around 12.91. They still didn't reach the height that Trinidad did a few weeks ago. And I put this to have people understand, relatively speaking, exactly how high our deaths were per million. India was pretty bad a few weeks ago. We saw that happening. Everybody saw it playing out on the internet with cars and in parking lots burning because the bodies were accumulating so quickly. But yet, look at this. They never crossed 4 deaths per million people, right? And whereas Trinidad was topping 14. So we were pretty high in terms of our demographic representation of what that meant to us. Bahrain also had a pretty high peak as well too, and they came all the way down post almost, I think, 90% vaccination now. And again, they had some variants that were causing trouble for the unvaccinated population, as did Seychelles, as did, of course, the UK, which is happening now, and a couple of other countries around the world. What I want to note here is the fact that this line is going down and then kind of stapling off in terms of the number of cases in the 56-day trend. And also here, it took a lot shorter for us to go from 120 to 150 million than it was to go from the initial 30 to 60 million when SARS-CoV-2 first appeared back in the 2000s. So that's something to consider. Our rate of increase is higher. How have we been doing with vaccinations? Just to give you an update, we're at about 15.26% now that have at least 1 dose. If we look at Canada, Bahrain, United States, they're close to 70%. Yeah, well, United States close to 54%, I should say. Europe is about 41.18, Brazil 34.98, India is 19.67. They're still crawling along because, of course, the enormity of their population. I mean, they've given millions of doses, but they have over 1 billion people. So therein lies their issue. And Trinidad and Tobago is right down here below Barbados and Guyana and Brazil and Argentina in our area. In terms of fully vaccinated, we're right about 6.3% right now. And so we're kind of in the light green part over here. And some of the countries, of course, have been doing a lot better based on the number of vaccines that they were given. But if we look at Africa in particular, you'd see a big disparity with what has been available for this region. So they are one of the most unvaccinated area. I think their vaccination rate is below 5% as a unit. Now, what's been happening because of this low amount of vaccination in these different areas, including places like India and Africa and other areas, is that it's giving the population a chance, population of viruses, a chance to mutate, because now they're getting more and more susceptible hosts. And more of these variants are going to come up. Now, we have variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of high consequence. And one of the big issues we have when we talk about long-term living with COVID is what kind of variants we're going to have to live with. Because if they're variants of interest, I mean, they're bad in that they could cause severe disease and death, but with proper vaccination, we should be okay, because we have the ability to actually control the transmissibility, the infections, and of course, eliminate almost entirely severe disease and death. When they become variants of concern and they've mutated out of that safe little package we put them in, that's where the problem comes in, where we have increased transmissibility or detrimental change of the epidemiology of the disease. Virulence has changed, it becomes more infectious, and actually changes the clinical disease presentation. And most importantly, the ability to be able to detect and diagnose is affected. We might miss it because it's mutated so far out from the tools that we have to detect it and sequence it and be able to determine that it's present. It might be missed, especially with the RT-PCR technology, and antigen, and of course lesser antibodies to a certain extent, because it would not produce the same type of antibodies, and the response would be different. But most importantly, if it evades vaccines and therapeutics, now that's big problems. We're actually seeing that right now with Gamma and Delta Plus, where it's actually showing to not be as effective. The vaccines are still as effective, but not as effective as it was against the original variants they were tested against. And the therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies are not working as effectively with some of these other variants that we're seeing, which is problematic than we would have seen with the original variants. That's what's going to continue to happen as these mutations accumulate over time. In terms of how the mutations have shaped the COVID-19 pandemic over time and what we can expect in the future, here are the prevalence of the coronavirus lineages and variants just in the US. I use this as a case study here to look at this. And as you look from February 2020, the A1 was dominant. Then the B1 started to take over. The B1, of course, is still around, but in much lower quantities, and it's kind of dying off now in terms of post-March 2021. The B1-2 took over. Then the epsilon and the iota that are variants of interest, they're not variants of concern. And then the alpha out of South Africa, and then the alpha, sorry, out of the UK, and then of course the delta, which is up here in the red, which is just now appeared over the last few months, right? But it's actually taking over in terms of the percentage. So you can see right here, this is the percentage. So it actually took over very, very quickly in terms of the amount of percentage that we actually saw. So if we go through this, just for the main ones, the A1 descended from the ancestral version of the COVID-19 virus that was first detected in China. And the A1 lineage is associated with some of the earliest cases of COVID-19 in the United States, including the outbreak in Washington, right? That was first detected. In January 2020, the numbers diminished as the other variants took hold in the country. Here's the A1 right here, it's broke out, and again, it's dropped off right in 2020, early 2020, right? So that was the first stuff that we saw straight out of China after the Wuhan outbreak. The B1 was associated also with the early 2020 outbreak in northern Italy. That was pretty severe. It developed a mutation called the D614G, which we thought was a big deal at the time. It was a big deal at the time, but of course now most of them have it. That's not much of a big deal anymore because we're able to actually control this variant quite effectively with the vaccines that we have. And of course, it's pretty much died out. It made it, however, better at infecting cells and allowing it to outkeep the earlier variants. So it pretty much went on to become the most dominant version, both globally and in the US, right? So that was what we originally called that Northern Italy version. The alpha was what we call the Kent version, which was first detected in the UK. And it actually had a whole bunch of mutations. One of them called P681H actually facilitates the virus's entry into the cells, right? And it actually helped it to become more 50% or more transmissible in the early forms. And this is the pink shaded area here. So it became dominant very, very quickly. And it reached the US in January. And by March 2021, it had already pushed out the other variants, and it was the dominant variant, right? And we're seeing that happening, or they're expecting that to happen with the Delta, which we're going to speak about next. And this is the phylogenetic tree here, which shows where the alpha is breaking out. Now, the Delta was first detected in India last October, and it helped fuel a devastating COVID-19 surge that set records for new infections and deaths. And of course, it has a lot of the mutations that we have in the other variants, but it has brand new mutations as well too in its genetic code. So we think it's at least 60% in some cases. In the UK, they're thinking more than 80% more transmissible than the alpha. It's already been recorded in more than 70 countries, and literally it's been here for like 2 months or 3 months, right? So it's crazy how fast this stuff is spreading. Based on the genome samples, the Delta is edging out the alpha in the US already. It's almost 35% already, accounting for the presence of that particular variant in the US. And it's tripled as alpha's already dropped off at 1/4. So it's outcompeting the alpha, which is the previous dominant one. Based on the recent government projection, they are assuming the Delta could be the dominant type within 1 month, because that's how fast it's moving, making it one of the most aggressive variants, really. I don't know why they're saying one of. It would have been the most aggressive variant to take hold in the US. And of course, it is the latest in a series of variants that have spread throughout the world, including the United States. This is the breakout here in terms of where it is and the ancestral tree. And one of the big things about these is that as these coronaviruses mutate and reproduce and replicate, more and more of the genetic changes are going to accumulate. Some of those genetic changes aren't going to matter, as I mentioned earlier on in the sessions. If you're copying from a book and you copy GREY, and you see GRAY, but you've copied the wrong letter, E instead of A, that doesn't change the meaning of the word. Everybody still knows it's gray, the color gray. However, if you copy down GRZY, it's going to be totally rubbish, and it's going to change it completely. So that's what happens sometimes. Some of these mutations can actually help the virus get better at infection, get better at evasion, and that's where the problem is. And sometimes things like this happen, where they push aside the previously adapted variants, and they actually become much more adapted to that population, right? Which is one of the concerns that we have with this. So the Delta is kind of marking a new phase in the pandemic. And they're calling it a dangerous phase because we're seeing how quickly they can push out the other variants with time. And that's really what the future living with COVID-19 is probably going to be in terms of our world, because as more and more of these variants accumulate, we might have more and more of these kinds of impacts that could be possibly devastating, like what we saw in India and so on, where there were almost 30,000 cases just in the month of April every single day on average, right? Which is crazy. And it just totally eliminated the other variants. And a lot of people were having issues. We're seeing people who are doubly vaccinated, who are having breakthrough cases with this Delta. And it's becoming a big problem for the worldwide community, right? What might be the future right now? It has already prompted limits in Australia, Israel, and India. Some countries are already back to indoor masking, even though they have double vaccinations, because we're actually seeing deaths accumulating, whereas before we never saw that, specifically with the Delta variant. So India is also warning of a new mutation challenge for this highly infectious Delta variant of the coronavirus. And they're saying that they might never return to a pre-pandemic life worldwide in the near future. Israel has put back on the indoor mask requirement. Australia went into a rare lockdown because Australia has, since the start of this pandemic, been in lockdown mode to, up and up, in different phases, but generally have been more or less open to their bubble at least. But now they're trying to lock down again to curb the outbreak of the Delta variant, kind of affected by what happened with India. It's already in dozens of countries, and it's going to be a big problem. Again, it's upwards of maybe 40 to 80% more transmissible, and it's spanned out already in England to become more than 95% prevalent in England as the most prevalent strain already, or variant already. As the Delta comes into the US, they're assuming that the potential toll on the public health is going to be problematic, even though the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccines have helped reduce hospitalization among patients with the variant worldwide, specifically in Oxford studies in Oxford AstraZeneca that came out of the UK. Less than half of the country in the United States is fully vaccinated, so they're saying that those people could be at risk. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we have much more than half. We only write about 5%, 6% fully vaccinated. So we would be really at risk if the Delta and the Delta Plus, which was another mutation that occurred in India most recently, it's already been sequenced in 50 samples. In India, 45 samples in the UK, and again, it seems to show about 80 to 100% increase in transmissibility. But big problems are here with the Delta Plus, because it seems to show a reduced response to monoclonal antibody therapies. We don't know where else it has spread. It hasn't been found. The Delta nor the Delta Plus has been isolated in Trinidad yet and sequenced. Canada is assuming that that variant is going to cause a greater surge in that country later on, when it's predicted that they're going to get a fall surge, which is what usually happens with respiratory diseases. Even though more than 75% of eligible Canadians have had at least one dose, and about 30 or 40% have had at least a second, they're quite nervous about what's going to happen with Delta and Delta Plus and these variants as they emerge. Vaccination-wise, Oxford AstraZeneca is in about 178 countries. Pfizer Biotech is in about 106. Moderna is in about 55. Gamaleya is in 45. Sinopharm is in 36. Johnson & Johnson's 27. And the other one of interest here is the Cuban vaccine, the Abdala and the Soberana, which are, of course, being tested in Cuba. So more and more vaccines are being used in more and more countries. Right now, I think we're at about 3.08 billion as of today, but there have been noted serious adverse effects with all of the vaccines that are in circulation to date, including blood clotting and vessel leaks with J&J and AstraZeneca, with blood clotting and myocarditis with the Pfizer, with Moderna, some blood clotting issues, and with the Sinopharm Sinovac, or the inactivated vaccine, of which we have the Sinopharm here locally, encephalitis, right? So there are known severe adverse effects with this, but really we have to be concerned about the weighing of the severe adverse effects of the vaccine versus the severe adverse effects of getting the actual disease. Health Canada has actually recommended people with rare blood conditions not to get the AstraZeneca vaccine because of their leaky vessel capillary leak syndrome, in addition to, of course, women under the age of 40, especially those in birth controls and anybody on HRTs, to pause if it is that there's another option to take. If there's not another option to take, and those individuals are in areas where there's a high COVID-19 risk, they are recommending, therefore, that you take the AstraZeneca if that's the only option available to you, because the risk-benefit ratio becomes weighed in the side of the vaccine in that case, versus the side of not the vaccine. So we have to make these kinds of decisions as we try to look onwards to our future living with COVID-19. Inevitably, it's going to look different. Our relationship with the virus is not going to hinge solely on its genetics hygiene, so what it does. Eventually, immune defenses are going to be raised that will pressure it selectively to be able to push it on its evolutionary path that it may not want to originally go on, right? But as more and more vaccines are in arms, I mean, right now we have about 3.08 billion, as more and more get into other parts of the world, we're not going to have these pools of unvaccinated people anymore, and fewer hosts infect, then the virus is going to start hitting roadblocks. It's going to start bumping its head up against evolutionary barriers, and eventually it will sputter out. That's really what the answer is. By vaccinating, we're going to make it less likely that new variants will emerge, right? That's what we need to actually do. In terms of people with comorbidities, and whether or not they're at higher risk for COVID-19 infection, yes, of course, that would be the cancers, the chronic kidney disease, all of these on the left here. These are all comorbidities that are associated with high risk for severe COVID-19, and these people are expected to be able to receive vaccinations as soon as they can. Of course, there are other things that aren't considered to be the normal comorbidities, for example, irritable bowel syndrome and those kinds of things. And there are actually research coming out every day that actually shows all of these different risks for people with different types of comorbidities and how they can actually contract severe COVID-19 infection and possibly have early deaths or die from it. And that's one of the issues. And of course, severe hospitalization, ICU admission, intubation, mechanical ventilation, and of course death, right? So all of these individuals are at risk for that. Yet still, there are vaccine holdouts, right? In terms of who doesn't want a shot. In the US in particular, as I said, they're right around 50%. And there are some areas where they're less than that. And it becomes dangerous because with the arrival of the Delta variants and these other variants, where we are going to see more transmissibility, those people who are no longer wearing a mask, for example, are going to become carriers for people who may not be vaccinated. And then it becomes more and more difficult to control. So the US is concerned about the holdout, so to speak, and there's a lot of educational, different types of educational seminars and attempts to educate the public in terms of investigating the key themes behind vaccine hesitancy and why, like misinformation, mistrust, and specific concerns, because people who are newly eligible, the youth, the younger people, are concerned about things that they're hearing about fertility, all of these kinds of things. And again, these are some myths and misconceptions that we're going to deal with next week in the final session, but I just wanted to mention it. And these are the kinds of people that we're concerned about. So in years to come, we're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with removing that vaccine hesitancy. We're eventually going to have to tinker with the vaccine recipes to keep pace with this ever-changing, fast mutating virus. Every vaccine we debut so far have had the potential to block a route that the virus may have otherwise taken. And that's something we need to consider. It is like if you are fighting a war. This is the analogy I always use. You're not going to fight a war with just one weapon. You can't just use tanks, right? That's the reason why people have Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all of these different people are coming at it in different ways, using different types of tactical strategies to defeat the enemy. Similarly, COVID-19, that's what we have to do. We have to come at this in different tactics. Not only do we need to reduce transmission and all of that, but we have to actually increase our vaccination and get our types of vaccinations in different ways, right? The viral genomes cannot be infinitely mutable. That means that they can only edit what they start with and what they've been given. And they cannot make certain changes without really crippling their ability to spread, right? So by the time we can get to our vaccination level that we want and use our vaccine shots that we have strategically, the higher risk people, the health workers, the people who have comorbidities, the people who are high on that targets of COVID-19, we can force that SARS-CoV-2 into a more predictable evolutionary path. And that's how we control it. That's how we live with it. And it becomes one of our vaccine treatable viruses that we see all the time and we have no issue with. That's how we do it, right? That's the way we gain control. If we're going to live with this virus in the long term, we have to be thinking about living it in 20 to 40 years. What do? Vaccinate. That's it. We've been living with, we just recently eradicated smallpox 40 years ago, but we're still living with polio. We're still living with measles, diphtheria, pertussis, mumps, rubella, all of these things, because we have these little pockets of epidemics here, there, and everywhere. Influenza, something we have to vaccinate every year. And we can use these vaccines to be able to build a sustainable relationship where we are the ones to turn the table on this virus. And we make the virus evolutions actually react to us rather than the other way around. Because right now we're playing catch up, right? That's really what we're happening. Vaccines can reduce the genetic pressure of the virus to mutate, so that eventually, as our collective defenses build, the SARS-CoV-2 might just be a nuisance. It would be like the common cold. Everybody would be like, oh, I got SARS again today. I got it last month. That might be how it is, because our immunity builds, and we're able to fight it off, so that it literally is just a normal little respiratory virus that comes and goes over seasons and doesn't cause the death and severities that we see. Right? Equitable vaccines is really the answer. It is all important, so that the mutational hotspots that we see in countries like India, in countries like Brazil, possibly in countries like Trinidad, where we have highly, unvaccinated populations, we're not going to see those mutations coming up and taking over. If left to its own devices, the virus could hypothetically bridle itself out, but it may have no incentive to, right? We can't count on the virus to become coincidentally less virulent. It's like saying, okay, well, we're going to wait until this enemy that we holding out here in this field, they're going to get tired just now, they're going to want to eat lunch and they're going to leave. We're going to just wait it out. No, we can't do that with SARS-CoV-2, right? We have to double down on our defense. And how do we double down on our defense? We use better tools and we spread those tools around. So we use better vaccines and we vaccinate as many people as we can find. Testing is still part of it. You might have to do your RT-PCR tests, yes, but you probably are going to have to do more home testing. It's probably going to come to Trinidad eventually. It's all over the world right now. There are people who are using it for weddings and parties and travel, where, especially if they're people like children, of course, 100% of the children under 12 are unvaccinated in the world right now. So anybody who wants to protect their family and the individuals of their family who are unvaccinated can use these as tools. They're very useful. We do COVID-19 antigen testing in the lab, genetics diagnostics, we do antibody testing and RT-PCR testing, but this kind of kits are designed to be kind of home use, so anybody could do it, right? Maybe we get to the point where we are on the dance floor in a bar or something, and we ask somebody, hey, you want to do this COVID-19 antigen test before we dance or something like that? Who knows how it's going to get, how this is going to develop, but this is something that's going to be mainstream, right? Mandatory vaccines. People ask me this all the time. Is it coming? Well, United States would love, and countries like ours would love to get herd immunity just by vaccination. They've been using a lot of incentives like tickets and free beer and free cannabis and all kinds of things. But generally, they've just given this little example, an anecdote here about George Washington back in the Civil War. Most of the English coming over to fight the Civil War were immune to smallpox, and most of the colonists weren't. So George Washington actually mandated, he realized that they were going to die out before they even fought in the Civil War, and he mandated smallpox vaccination. And at the time, people had no issue with it because they realized that it was the way to go. Vaccination rate is stalling right now in different regions around the world, including countries with very high vaccine hesitancy in areas in the South, in the States, and so on. And they're using incentives, they're using lotteries, they're using all kinds of different things. But eventually, they probably might have to mandate vaccines, as certain countries have done already with different mandates for different vaccinations. Most schools have already had vaccine mandates in place and have had them in at least for my lifetime, and quite for a long time for most of us. So it's not unusual to consider that might be an option in the future, where we actually living with mandated vaccines. Can the vaccine force the virus mutations on the other side? Is that a caveat to deployment of vaccines? While inoculations are themselves the cause of the mutations, the immunity that we provide can actually nudge the virus into saying, okay, well, if we keep getting neutralized this way, more and more mutations are going to accumulate in the other direction, right? So a less than stellar vaccine, this happened before, to block Marek's disease in chickens, actually changed mutations in the virus into becoming more highly transmissible and virulent, and making the pathogen more dangerous to unvaccinated birds. So we've seen this before. Right now, there's no evidence this happening in SARS-CoV-2. And that is why it's so important to get those vaccines in arms before this virus can mutate to become a big threat to those who aren't immune, right? That's one of the key factors in getting vaccinations out as fast as we possibly can. It can also drive the spread of variants that are better at eluding our defenses, and we might eventually get from variants of concern into variants of high significance. If that happens, then we're in big trouble, because not only can it drive the variants to be better at eluding our defenses, but it can be better evasion, stumping our shots. And we're seeing that already with the Delta. We're seeing that already with the Delta Plus, where they've already demonstrated the ability to dodge certain antibodies and monoclonal antibodies and so on, and also enter into the host more easily. So that's a risk, right? As the variants develop, the symptoms even are changing. So now Delta is kind of appearing more like a common cold, where it's actually not so much the sense of smell and taste and the severe respiratory distress that we're seeing with the others. It's more like congestion, runny nose, headache, and we're seeing more and more people expressing those symptoms, even sneezing and coughing, before it becomes more serious. So don't take it lightly. If it is you think you got something and you feel it might be it's just allergies or it's just the seasonal cold, go get tested, because a lot of times it's happening that it's spiraling out of control very, very rapidly, because the symptoms are changing again, because of the mutations that's accumulating and the difference. More and more vaccination means less hospitalization, right? As more effective vaccines become more available, eventually COVID-19 hospitalizations are going to be largely unnecessarily. That's basically what they're seeing in the US and other places where they have highly vaccinated populations in small areas, because they have a really high concentration of individuals who are vaccinated. Similarly, in areas where they have very high concentration of unvaccinated, they're seeing good, very high concentration of positive tests, right? And we're seeing like little what we call mini epidemics in those areas where they have to contact trace the employees and those kinds of things. And they're strongly encouraging people to actually be vaccinated to kind of reduce this. I wanted to put this up here for kind of the future story. How can we cure SARS-CoV-2 with gene editing? So there's a lot of work going on with CRISPR, which is a fancy name for a gene editing technique where we could actually change the techniques that we use so far for gene sequencing of these viruses, for being able to validate certain tests for these viruses, for being able to deliver vaccines and deliver antivirals for viruses like SARS-CoV-2. And it's been actually shown to actually be very, very effective, right? This particular technique here, this is the spike protein, this is the viral RNA genome, this is the ACE2 and viral entry. This is how it actually gets in. This is, of course, where most vaccines and antibody targets. And they've actually been able to look at targeting this area via CRISPR to try to determine where are the best sites in order to be able to hit the virus hard, to be able to get a more effective vaccine. So they're using these kinds of techniques to actually change our methodology of how we choose where in the genome are we going to target. What part of the viral RNA genome, what part of the spike protein is the best target? We actually were able to actually show some scientists that using the CRISPR-Cas13d inhibits 98% of live SARS-CoV-2 virus in different lung epithelial cells that were transfected with the CRISPR-Cas9 construct, and actually showed that they had very low viral load and cell viability over the period, and high cell viability over time, which is great, right? And with the variants, it's actually showing to be effective as well too. So this could be actually an excellent antiviral. This is the alpha, zeta right here. This is the epsilon, and they're actually showing pretty good, almost 90-95%, in some cases 96%, in terms of protecting against the SARS-CoV-2 variants. And this is all in model cell culture models, right, in the lab. They're actually showing what we call pan coronavirus inhibition using these techniques as well too, which means all the different types of coronaviruses that they checked, MERS, SARS, and all the different cores, including SARS-CoV-2, really, really well at actually having this coverage over the majority of the coronaviruses by using these gene editing techniques to be able to defeat them. And that's been working out fantastically. In terms of delivery models, like for the lipid nanoparticle delivery, can actually treat the coronavirus infection. So this is important for drug delivery, using nanoparticles to actually take it into the body and target the cells. Excellent results that they're actually seeing with this. And basically, they've been working really hard at expanding this CRISPR gene editing toolbox, not only for all the different genetic disorders that we know that can be used for, but specifically for the SARS-CoV-2 model, where we could actually get rid of the viral protein and maybe even degrade the genome over time via these techniques, right? And what's happening in terms of vaccines? Well, we have the under 12s coming up in the fall. They're fighting right now amongst themselves of whether or not we're going to go to full FDA approval or still seek the EUA, which is the emergency use authorization, because the 2 to 12-year-olds are a tricky group, right? They're not like adults, and how you treat them and what you give them. So the pediatricians are weighing in, and they're trying to decide whether or not their immunogenicity is so different that we actually have to do a full FDA approval or not, right? There are other groups of scientists that are also saying, let us go towards the full FDA and don't just leave the EUA to cover it, right? So there's a lot of people trying to demand more information. So with people who are being skeptical, they are being listened to. Like, I don't want people to feel that we are just barreling towards this vaccine model and that's it, and nobody's caring what anybody else is saying. That's not happening. They're asking for more examination to what's happening. They're saying, okay, continue using the vaccines with your EUAs, but at the same time, simultaneously, let's run a 2-year investigation, which we normally do, and let's try to confirm all the substantial evidence that we see, whether or not it outweighs the harms. Look at the spike proteins in situ, what's happening, all the things that they didn't have time to do officially in terms of the amount of time that was spent doing it, even though it was done in the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. They're saying that if you and it makes sense, if you go through and jump through all the hoops, eventually that might reduce vaccine hesitation, and that might allow people to actually have increased public confidence of these COVID-19 vaccines and actually be able to back up legal support. If people want to do employer-instituted vaccine mandates, if we're moving towards vaccine mandates, you can't really do that unless you have FDA approval. And so they're saying, okay, well, let's go ahead with this route, but at the same time, let's go ahead with our analysis, which is what we normally do, and have the gene delivery and the therapy experts check out everything and try to get the approval decisions in a more official way, because that might reduce vaccine hesitancy. So there are different pressures for that as well too. And of course, these are the major vaccine companies in terms of what they have available. And again, I want to emphasize this point down here. Still, even with the variants, we're seeing them being highly effective, not as effective in terms of full 100% infections, right? I mean, we don't have that with most of them, but we're seeing that they definitely reduce the risk and the chance of hospitalization and death prevention. The Sputnik, which is the traditional inactivated vaccine, just like the Sinopharm and the Sinovac. A lot of people ask about this. This study came out in February 2021 in the Lancet, which is a very prestigious journal, that showed that the Sputnik 5 COVID-19 vaccine candidate appears to be safe and effective. While it has not officially received WHO approval to date, it's being used in many countries. Sinovac just recently, June the 1st, received WHO approval. And of course, the Cuban Soberano and the Abdala, I mentioned when you saw the slide of where the viruses are being used, are being tested in Cuba. And again, they are interesting because they are being coupled with the tetanus toxin, which gives it a kind of a conjugate vaccine model that gives it an extra boost of antigen and makes it a stronger vaccine. And they're seeing over 92% efficacy in their trials. In terms of the vaccine options, we have about 15 approved right now. We're moving towards 339 trials, which is great, and more coming out over time, right? We have the CureVac, we have the Novavax, I mentioned the Soberano, we have the Sanofi GSK. Some of these are being produced to be delivered via the nasal spray method, which people are very excited about. Some are being produced to be patches that you just stick a patch, like a nicotine patch on your arm. So a lot of these are looking at great options. Some of them are not going to be against spike protein. They're going to be against the nuclear capsid proteins, as I mentioned before. More and more targets are coming up. So we're going to increase our artillery. So our story is going to be a lot stronger this time next year. We're going to have a lot more options. Are we going to be in a position where we're going to have boosters and boosters and more boosters? People keep asking. Well, COVID-19 variants mean that we need a booster shot for a booster, maybe. That's all I could say. We know that there are different combinations that work. We know that boosters have been showing to actually be giving a better chance at fighting this. And the reason why vaccines may have to be changed every year or not changed every year is because of their ability to mutate, as I mentioned before. Now, the coronaviruses mutate much slower than influenza. So that although the existing vaccines appear to be slightly less effective, so I mean, like you'll see like 52% effective against Gamma, you might see a 62% effective against Delta, and you're like, oh gosh, well, that's not 95, 98. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have to be changed. That might be good enough, right? For being able to give us that little boost, as we call it. And already the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that's being changed and being tweaked to have a piece of the genetic code for the corona spike protein has already been in production right now, about to come out, Pfizer Moderna as well, where they're going to be reactive against the new variants as opposed to the old versions that they were. So this could be updated every year, who knows? And they might put in the new variant, kind of like the flu model, where the antigenic flu model comes up and has to be changed every year. We might have to do that with flu. But right now, we don't know whether or not that's going to happen, right? The booster dose technically is not a booster dose because you're going to give that additional shot. So the levels of circulating antibody kind of peters out over a while, and that additional spot gives a little boost, basically, is what it does. We do that with diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccines already. Pretty much most of the vaccines we have, those particularly for infants to build immunity against the bacteria responsible for those, and 3 booster shots. And we give it later in childhood. I think 3 months, 6 months, 3 years, 2 years, I can't remember it. But anyway, they spread it out throughout the child's life. And early childhood, I should say. By 6, they're done. And for COVID-19, the situation might be similar. That happens to the seasonal flu. We might have to do more of a yearly kind of thing. So children and adults might have to get a new vaccine every year because the influenza virus mutates so quickly. It's so highly antigenic. It makes the last season's virus vaccine completely obsolete. So every year immunization moves off. And coronavirus is like that. It has very notoriously known to be extremely changeable in terms of its immunity, right? In terms of effects, adverse side effects, are there adverse side effects of vaccines? Yes. We see the myocarditis. It's been happening with the mRNA vaccine vaccines like the Pfizer and the Moderna. And it's happening in terms of thousands versus 300 or 400 million of doses given. We're seeing thousands of cases. And they're saying that they're comfortable with the myocarditis numbers because even though the condition is mild, the benefits outweigh any risk. And that's what they're concluding. They're saying that even though the US and Israel have been seeing these myocarditis rates, the rates which they're seeing is not that high to stop the Pfizer dosing, right? And they actually are proving it already for vaccinating children 12 years and up, and most children in Israel and the US are going to get that vaccine. So if you look at the potential harm, just take the example of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. Here's the potential benefits. This is the ICU COVID admission prevented over these different age groups, and this is the potential harm. As you can see, as you get older, definitely the benefits outweigh the harms. It is really in the younger group that we have to evaluate it, specifically with this particular AstraZeneca shot. And similarly with the Pfizer, similarly with the different ones that cause risk in different demographics, we have to evaluate it in a case-by-case basis, kind of like this, literally with the potential benefit, the potential harm. Look to see whether or not there's COVID-19 prevalent in that country, whether or not there are other options for vaccinations, all of those kinds of things. Eventually, we're going to get next generation vaccines because we don't have that slow mutation happening that happens we have a slower mutation that's happening that we don't have with influenza, which mutates very, very quickly. And we don't have to wait a whole 2 years for it to grow in embryo, chicken eggs, and those kinds of things. But the new technologies mean that somebody has to update the vaccine still, right? So we're probably going to have to get it yearly. Now, a lot of these mutations are predictable in that we kind of can figure out which direction it's going, because it tends to be in a particular area because of how slowly it mutates, right? So even though they have to be adopted and changed every year possibly, and the long lasting immunity might have to be boosted with that, we can actually predict a lot more accurately where the additional mutations are going to be high. We're going to be able to figure out where, using testing, using RT-PCR, using antigen testing, using antibody testing, where these pockets are, and aim our vaccination strategy in the future to be able to live with this virus long term. So we're going to shift away now from just randomly vaccinating everybody and doing more targeted viral vaccination to reduce virus transmission and viral transmission, to be able to decrease those severe disease and death in populations that are not vaccinated, right? In terms of how long immunity can last from the vaccines, good news, Pfizer and Moderna are likely to produce much lasting immunity from these studies. Similarly, there's studies coming out with Sinopharm, Sinovac, AstraZeneca, J&J that's showing that the immunity is lasting much longer than we previously thought it would. So sometimes it's looking in excess of 8, 9, 10 months right now. So hopefully we can get away without doing, less than a year boosters. Are we going to need the boosters every year? Probably. It's too early to say right now, but we're going to probably get the vaccination individuals to mount a partial response to new variants, but we're probably going to have to give them a boost to be able to get that really strong immune response that we want. Right, as I mentioned, mixing vaccines is coming up. We have countries that are already recommending that they mix vaccines, first and second dose, and then a third booster. Sometimes in the case of AstraZeneca or even Pfizer or Sinopharm is actually giving that long-term immunity that we want to see. So we might have to move towards that particular area. In terms of restrictions, in terms of mask back on, mask with 2 doses, yes, they're saying because the Deltas and all of these guys are more infectious than we thought, we're going back to wearing masks, and sometimes masks even though you're fully vaccinated indoors, right? And that's okay, because it means that while that variant is in circulation, we're going to have to control it, because we can still shed and we can still infect those around us. Most importantly, people who are unvaccinated, which is under 12-year-olds. Everybody in the entire world is unvaccinated right now. Our immunocompromised family members, our older people who can't take the vaccine, we have to protect them. So if it is that there is a variant that's circulating and we're worried, just wear a mask. It's not that big a deal. There's going to come a point where we don't have to wear a mask anymore. But while those things are showing up, we have to be able to fight it. And that's how we live with it, right? That's what we're going to move towards. Do vaccines work? I always love to show this slide. Here we have the exact inverse correlation of the increase of vaccination and the decrease of deaths in the United States. This could be similar for most other countries who are highly vaccinated now that actually show that, with of course pause for the variant stages that are happening. But generally, this is what we see. As more and more individuals are vaccinated, we're going to see that reduction of death and severe disease. How do we end this pandemic? We come back to, and how do we live with COVID-19 in the long term? We have to be able to, decrease climate change. It's a serious thing. Be able to stop that encroachment of populations into wildlife, stop the illegal trafficking. That is where that zoonotic jump occurs. And we have to stop that as much as we can while we can. In terms of physical blocking, the mask wearing, the portal of entry, here, we have to stop it. We have to get that virus from not being able to get into your body. If you look at flu and the incidence of flu, it's almost nil right now in a lot of parts of the world. And it's because of that. It's because we are washing our hands, we're wearing our masks, and we are stopping that respiratory disease transmission, which is what we need to do, that person to person, airborne. We're cutting it out, we're isolating, maintaining distance. That's what we need to do. But most importantly, this is where our big news comes. If we are able to vaccinate enough people, eliminate the susceptible hosts, and get to herd immunity, that's how we live with this. We're going to have a happy story. We might get to the smallpox story 30, 40 years from now, just like what we did 40 years ago for smallpox. I mean, it took 200 years for smallpox. Hopefully, it's not going to take 200 years for COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. But we're going to be living with this for a little while longer. And the way we do it is through this. We have to vaccinate, and we have to get our arsenal high. We have to hone it, and we have to aim it properly and be able to do this in a tactical, sensible way. We can't do it ad hoc. We can't start and stop. We can't figure out where we want to use this and then use this and stop this. And we have to come at it with everything. We have to come at it with therapeutics. We have to come at it with cutting edge diagnostics to find these mutations, sequence as many as we can, cast that net out. We can't just be sequencing positive samples. We have to be using surveillance around the general population. We have to be able to do that. Otherwise, we don't know what our true positivity rate is. We don't know what exactly is happening. Our positivity rate is over 25% right now. That's way too high. That has to come down to 5%. We have to test more. We have to vaccinate more. So I would urge you to get vaccinated as soon as you can. If vaccines are not available, encourage your MP, speak to your local health authorities, try to be able to have those vaccines available and demand it. It is our right to be vaccinated. We need to be vaccinated as fast as we can. Ideally, what is the best vaccine? I keep on saying this, whatever you are offered to, of course, you have to be able to get to that point of having full vaccination. So again, thanks so much for your interest. And I would like to end now for any questions.
Well, Dr. Amlachan, what an explosion of information and facts. Very, very fascinating stuff. I would encourage the audience to use their chat box to submit questions so that we can continue this for a little bit longer, just to try and draw out a little bit more information. I have a couple of quick questions while we are waiting for the audience. Do you think, or is there evidence that we actually have the Delta or Delta plus virus variant in Trinidad as yet?
Well, they're saying they don't have it. We are not involved in the sequencing at present. We are starting to. So we might be able to answer you that in the future because we are intending at UTT and with Genix, we're trying to get into more of assisting with that client. And there are people who I think CAFA has gotten a couple of machines to help with that and so on. Right now, they're just doing surveillance of positive samples, and they're picking and kind of choosing in terms of they're not casting as wide a net as possible. So as of right now, they have no. That is correct. I would say I would agree with them if that's what they reported, but that is in part because of our high positivity rate, because we're really sampling only positive people and not asymptomatic people, and we're not sequencing large numbers right now, right? So it's hard to say whether or not it's here or not. We are seeing a constant amount of deaths though, and we are seeing our cases not really coming down really quickly. So we have something going on, probably variance wise, whether or not it's Delta or not, it's hard to say right now.
Okay, well, that brings me to that question that is at the back of everybody's mind, which is we do seem to have a fairly high level of deaths relative to our population. Listening to some of the other countries, particularly African countries, I forget which country, one of the southern African countries said they had about 30,000 cases and 200 deaths. I was rocked by that, considering they have much bigger population than we do. And yet
So does
still,
Taiwan. Yeah, Taiwan does too. A lot of those
deaths.
Asian countries have those numbers as well.
Yeah, is there something in our population that we need to look at long term that might be responsible for our high level of deaths? For example, basically our being unhealthy.
Yeah, well, comorbidity is a big thing, right? One thing that I don't hear mentioned in Trinidad, and it's mentioned all over the world, is the obesity comorbidity. Comorbidity of obesity is a big deal, and it actually is known to increase your risk of severe disease by COVID-19 and risk of death. And as you know, we have, people don't like to hear it, but we have a large percentage of our population that is considered by BMI calculations to be obese. So that's one of the reasons as well too. I suspect that we have a lot of comorbidities as well, but then I also suspect too that we live in communities where it's becoming harder and harder to isolate. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing in terms of the number of cases and the number of deaths, in that we're seeing high viral loads, where in other areas people might be more, in family households where you might have 3 to 5 people. In Trinidad, we might have family households that have 10 to 15 in some cases. And that kind of creates a little, almost like a mini epidemic in that household. So that can be contributing to it as well. I mean, this is speculation, but I suspect that those things are contributing to it. But one thing of concern, and I want to emphasize this with our viewers, is please seek help as soon as you get symptoms, because I think one of the reasons why it's deteriorating so quickly into severe disease is that people are lollygagging about at home, and they think I might have a sniffly nose, or, I'm feeling kind of feverish, but it's nothing. And the next thing you know, 2 days later, they're being rushed to the hospital and succumbing to COVID. So that's one of the things too. It seems to be not only infecting with higher transmissibility, but it seems to be creating a situation of more severe disease a lot faster than we saw before, in a shorter period of time.
At risk of being boring, I just want to echo exactly what you just said. Speaking to some of my colleagues, one of the heads of the intensive care at Cuba, he says the people who are dying are the obese patients. It's just, unfortunately, you can spot them when they come in because they're obese and they have COVID and they progress rapidly. And the second point you made is a very, very important one, where at the initial stages, people will say, stay at home, don't come in. But
Correct.
That's quite the opposite of what they should be doing. They should move very quickly. I'm not too sure if we have any. Let me just see. There's a thing there, a question, not just yet. One last one from me then would be the newer vaccines that are coming out that you've talked about, which are very exciting. Where are we with the non-injectable vaccines? Do you think some of the anti-vaxxers are afraid to get injected? And if it was a simpler way,
sure.
say a little sniff up the nose or a sweet or something, they would be less likely to be so resistant.
Yeah. Well, I think most of them are in phase 3 trials now. A lot of it is, of course, the amount of money that they're pushing in it, right? So Novavax has a protein subunit vaccine. They've been taking their good time. It's supposed to be in phase 3 trials, but they're not out yet. And there are a couple of companies that are doing like the nicotine patch, as I said, that are in phase 2 going into phase 3 trials. But in terms of timing, a lot of people are trying to be less hasty, I think, than in the initial production of vaccines, because they don't want to run into some of the regulatory problems that we saw with the other vaccines, and of course some of the vaccine hesitancy issues. So a lot of these companies are not cutting corners and trying to take their time. The Soberano and the Abdallah two good examples of that. I mean, they have used traditional technologies, but they're using a conjugate where they're piggybacking on the tetanus toxoid, right? And they are taking their good time. They're not trying to, I mean, and they're showing good efficacy, 92% right now, or 93%, I think, in the latest data, in terms of preventing infection, and severe disease and death is almost 100%. So more as before the end of the year, we probably will have at least 2, maybe 3 options. I'm not sure which one of them will come out first. I don't know if the nasal spray will beat the rest of them to the and be the winners of the race. But I'm hoping that that we have some other options. As I keep on saying, the more the merrier, because we need to increase our artillery. That's what we need to do. We fight in a war, frankly, and we have to be able to get more and more weapons to fight it in different ways. It can't all be spike protein vaccines, right? Because it can easily mutate away from the presentation that we have now. So we have to be able to get into the whole virus, in some options, the nuclear capsid and other options, and tweak it, right? So, I mean, it's great that we're able to actually tweak the mRNA vaccines so quickly to the variants, right? So we actually including right now all of them, AstraZeneca, J&J, Pfizer and Moderna, are already gone back to the drawing board and tweaking their mRNA spike protein vaccines to account for the mutations, to make sure that they're more effective against the variants. But I mean, that can't be the only weapon, right? So we are happy to receive more vaccines. And again, it really doesn't matter so much what you get now. I keep on telling people who are fixated and like, well, I'm waiting for this and I'm waiting for that. I mean, just get vaccinated, and get vaccinated as fast as you can, because it's going to come a point where we probably will have to get a 3rd booster. We probably will have to get a yearly shot living in the long term, frankly. And that's really why I wanted to do this particular episode, so that people understand that this is a long-term situation that we're going to be living with. This is not going to go away anytime soon. So you can't just feel 2 shots in my arm of the best vaccine that I waited for X amount of months after, and you've exposed yourself and your family to virus. You may have gotten infected. You may have long-term COVID. You may have, which is a serious thing. I mean, we're going to talk about those in another later standalone session. But that is a serious thing. You don't want long-term long-haul COVID at all. I mean, I have friends and family members with it who are 15 months later, can't hear properly, can't walk properly. I mean, you should hear their complaints. It's the strangest things that you would never believe that happened because of COVID-19 infection, and it's happening to them. And that you don't want to be in that situation. So I would say, do not risk infection and try to be vaccinated as soon as you can.
A very important message. Get there and get vaccinated. So I just want to move on quickly because we're getting a few questions here. Sure. Kevin John has asked, is there a specific drug can be given when hospitalized? That's the first question. And then you also asked, if herd immunity is reached, is there still a need to vaccinate? And there were other questions after that.
Okay, so let's do the drugs. Yeah, there are drugs that are being used all over the world in different scenarios, depending on how severe the disease is. If you remember one of the earlier presentations, if you watched it, but you might not. There, you could start off with as simple as fluids and acetaminophen in terms of the at-home status, and then if you are hospitalized, you might have to get into the antivirals, and then eventually the monoclonal antibodies, and of course, more physical interventions like the ventilator and those kinds of things at the same time as the dexamethasone and all those other combinations. But there are combinations of drugs being given to treat individuals at the different stages, whether it's mild to moderate, whether it's moderate to severe, and whether it's severe to really severe. And that's how it's pretty much divided. So yeah, there are different monoclonal antibody therapies and different things that are being used. And I guess Mark could probably mention some things that he knows about as well too, if he wants to fill in terms of current therapies. But yes, there are quite a few being used.
So there are therapies that are used around the world that we are beginning to think about. Tocilizumab is a very good drug.
Yes.
It's actually a rheumatoid drug, but it works by working against the IL-6 interleukin, which is responsible for the large amount of inflammation and pneumonitis, which causes actually a lot of the death. But I mean, I don't want to take up time talking about all the other drugs. There was another question he asked, which was...
Yeah, he was talking about herd immunity,
yes.
And if there's a need to vaccinate. Yes. There will always be a need to vaccinate because of that situation where we're going to see those mutations. The problem is if herd immunity is not received simultaneously across the entire world, which there's no way it's going to happen. We've seen that with the vaccine inequity that's happening around the world. If that doesn't happen simultaneously, you're going to have these pockets of large unvaccinated populations that act as mutatable vats for these viruses to mutate and become more and more evading, increase the evading ability of the vaccine. So it's a kind of a catch-22 situation. The less you vaccinate, the more you have the variants. The more you vaccinate, the less you have the variants. But it has to literally be a simultaneous control worldwide. It's like fighting a war, right? That's literally it. That's what World War II and World War I was. Everybody had to fight. All the countries had to come together and fight at the same time. And that's literally what has to happen. The people with the haves have to give the have-nots. The people who are hoarding 60 million J&J in their freezers that are going to expire need to release them. Time to let that go now. Time to get it out to the people who need it. Vaccinate your people who are high risk, yes, but I mean, I don't know why they're waiting. Personally, this is my soapbox. I always joke with my friends that maybe these countries are waiting to vaccinate their cats and their dogs next before they send these vaccines out to people who need it. Because I mean, you had the money and you had the wherewithal to order 5 times, in the case of Canada, 500% of the vaccines that you needed. But okay, now that you've gotten your 60% or your 75%, it's time now to start letting it go and give to people who need. And that without that, we're not going to see herd immunity. So little pockets of herd immunity is fantastic for those little pockets, but the rest of the world are going to affect the little pockets. And they're starting to realize that now. Look what's happening with the UK. Their numbers are like that now, because the unvaccinated people are being affected by the variants. And we're actually seeing cases with doubly vaccinated people because we're seeing breakthroughs. So, I mean, it's no longer this idea that I'm going to hoard and vaccinate my people and, you catch tail until I decide I'm going to throw some vaccines at you. It can't be like that, because we are all part of this world community and we are going to affect each other. And eventually what we grew and what we have by us in our unvaccinated population is going to come back and bite these guys, in their butts.
Right. So possibly one of the last questions. It's a split question. The second part is commentary on the government and their strategy, which I don't think is really where we need to be with the government strategy. But the first part is open. I think it says, is TNT's lockdown strategy working? Do you think
the strategy of lockdown traditionally has been to be utilized to pause certain things while other things take place. So it cannot be your only strategy. That's my only comment when it comes to lockdown. It has to be utilized in a concept of a strategy. So first of all, you have to have a vaccination strategy, and you have to have a pandemic control strategy in order to be able to utilize these things like lockdowns, closing borders, and all of that. It cannot be used in isolation, right? So I would say it can be an effective tool in the fight against the spread of these variants if used effectively, at the same time as increasing vaccination, for example, right? And increasing therapeutics at the severe and mild to moderate level, and that kind of stuff. It has to be kind of like coming at it from different ways. As I always use my war analogy, right? It can't be one thing, right? If it is that, you're doing, if they're coming to bomb you in London, you can't just take off your lights and sit down and wait for the bombers to fly overhead and hope they don't see the city of London. That can't be your only strategy. That could be one, right? But you have to be able to fight them. You have to get your own fighter jets to fly up there and shoot them down. So similarly, we have to have different ways of fighting this. It can't be one or the other. It has to be everything in together. That we have to actually get all of our eggs together and put them all in one basket and say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to fight this, and be able to fight it like that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think on that, I think we will, sorry, one last question, if you don't mind. It says, sure. Is it possible for vaccinated people to shed spike protein?
I don't know about specifically spike protein, but they can shed virus, because vaccinated people can also be infected with virus just like unvaccinated people, right? If you are vaccinated, what you are vaccinated with stays inside of you. So you cannot shed spike protein from the vaccine, if that's what you're saying, no. But if you are infected with virus, you can shed virus, right? Like whole virus. And that's how you can get other people infected. That's how we're recommending, even if you are vaccinated with your 2 doses and you are 2 weeks post the second dose, you are still to wear masks indoors. That's the new well, I should say the old new recommendations are back again, where they're saying, let's control the outbreaks and let's control the little mini epidemics we're seeing with the new variants and go back to mask wearing where we can. Certain populations, the US, they're still in certain areas still saying no, they want to be mask free, and that's fine. But in other areas, in other parts of the world, including Trinidad, we're saying no, mask up. Because you want to prevent the individuals around you who have not been vaccinated. Again, 100% of the under 12-year-olds, well, in our case, 100% of the under 60-year-olds generally, well, I should say 100%, but the ones who are not, who don't have comorbidities, the ones who are not healthcare workers and all that, almost, and nobody has been fully vaccinated in that population. So we have to protect them. So we have to wear our masks. We have to be able to stop that shedding of virus. That's what we want, fully infective virus not to be shed. We need to stop it. And that's where the isolation comes in. That's where the minimizing contact comes in. That's when the mask wearing comes in. It's through that, because we want to minimize that.
Okay, well, on that note, I would say thank you so much, Dr. Ramlachan, for an enthralling discussion yet again. I would like to remind our audience that this series has its 10th and final episode next Thursday at about 6 o'clock, and I would invite.
And it's exciting. It's myths and misconceptions. We're crushing them.
Thank you very much for advertising it. I was hoping you would get that, and so now we know it's out. So we can hardly wait. This has been an enthralling journey through COVID-19, and thank you very much, Dr. Ramlachan, for giving of your time.
Don't forget, it's also being shown on ITV. Repeats on ITV,
and it's also on YouTube as a recorded as records for people who want to go back, and ITV. So you can avail of this and even absorb all this amount of information that's coming at you at a slower rate and really grasp it well.
You can pause me every 5 seconds, which I think you need to do to be able to understand me, right?
So, no, I don't think so. I think people will get them. But again, thank you very much, Dr. Ram.
And thanks to our listeners. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sticking it out with us. And thanks to UTT for allowing us to do this. It's great. And thanks again for Mark and Gansham, our very studious guy technical guy who helps us with all of the little things that we don't understand. Thank you so much. And again, good night to viewers, and thanks for listening. Hope this helps you be able to demystify COVID-19 vaccination.